say good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kata Beilin, Faculty Director of LASIS, and I have an honor and pleasure to welcome you to our session, today's session of our migration webinar that Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program of University of Wisconsin-Madison has prepared in collaboration with the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies of the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. So I wanted to say thank you to the teams of both centers, to our panelists, to our public. And I wanted to start reflecting on the fact that we always talk about migration as a process in which people search for a better home. And today, this better home is very near. It's bringing us home. So we'll be talking about the migration from Latin America to Midwest. And the panel has been prepared and will be moderated by Professor Armando Ibarra, who is an associate professor of the School for Workers and also the director of Chicano and Latino Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has published extensively on Latino question, which is the title of one of his books, and labor, and has also acquired a lot of experience as an organizer and teacher in the context of migration, labor, and education. So without spending more time on introductions, everybody is waiting for the presentations of our panelists. I am passing it to Armando. Thank you, Armando, for preparing that panel.
I think the most heard words probably in our current context is "you're muted," and I just had to unmute myself right now. But thank you, Professor Beilin, for the introduction. And I also want to recognize and thank Alberto Vargas, who is the Associate Director of LASIS, and also M. Mager, whose position title right now is as a Migration Seminar Series Assistant, and who will also be helping us with the technology today. And everybody at LASIS for creating the space of discussion of a very important item that we seem to have been talking about for the last 100 years, and that's migration from Latin America to the US. So I would like to introduce the panel theme itself. The title of this panel is Immigration from Latin America to the Midwest. The current Latino population is a result of the dynamics of the political economy of contemporary liberal capital states. Today, Latinos number nearly 61 million and comprise 18.5% of the total US population, up from 3.5% in 1960. If these trends continue, it is projected that by 2060, the Hispanic share of the US population will reach 28.6% and number approximately 120 million. The demographic group that I self-identify as being Mexican origin now holds the dubious distinction of being the largest ethnic minority group in the United States, leading to the so-called browning of America, and browning in air quotes. California has the largest share of the US Latinos. The LA Times reported that as of July 1st, 2014, about 14.99 million Latinos live in California, edging out the 14.92 million whites, making it the first state in the nation to have a minority as a majority in its demographic composition. This shift has caused the onset of one of the most dramatic cultural and demographic transformations in history, have intensified due to social and economic justice movement organizations in the state. The browning of California is not unique, folks. This demographic transformation is occurring not only in the traditional Southwest, but also in the Midwest, especially in the South and the Northeast. In fact, this shift, along with the conflict it has brought, is occurring across the country in urban and rural areas whose local populations once believed they were immune to internal and international Latin American migration and settlement. States such as Wisconsin are now witnessing transformations as decades ago. In June 2014, a Wisconsin Journal Sentinel headline proclaimed, Hispanics now make up Wisconsin's largest minority group, signaling that Latinos as the largest minority group in less than 20 years. Today, our panelists have been asked to discuss their scholarship and work as they relate to immigration from Latin America to the Midwest within the context that I just outlined. The topics that we will be discussing is how do we theorize about and study immigration? What are some of the major impulses or reasons people migrate? And looking at some of those migration patterns. We will discuss a little bit about the impacts of law and citizenship on new arrivals in subsequent generations. We will also touch on in the practice of racialization, policing, and profiteering, and we can't leave out the importance of COVID-19 to the way it impacts contemporary migration in immigrant communities in the US. And of course, we'll be talking a little bit about the elections of 2020, the presidential elections of 2020. Start Dr. Marla A. Ramirez, a historian of the US-Mexico borderlands with specializations in history, Mexican repatriation, migration, and gendered immigration experiences. Professor Ramirez completed her doctoral degree at the University of California, Santa Barbara in Chicano studies with an emphasis in feminist studies. Prior to joining UW-Madison, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard. Professor Ramirez is currently writing a book tentatively titled Contested Illegality, Mexican Repatriation, Banishment, and Prolonged Consequences Across 3 Generations. Dr. Alfredo Carlos is a faculty member in the Department of Political Science at California State University, Long Beach. He was born in Jerez, Zacatecas, Mexico, and migrated with his family to the harbor area of Los Angeles. He grew up in an immigrant working class. Research and teaching interests center around political economy with focus on inequality, wealth and poverty, and labor struggles in Latino communities. He is also the founder and director of the Foundation for Economic Democracy that focuses on developing democratic community and worker ownership in the economy. And more recently, the political consulting firm Strategic Latino Consulting. Dr. Carlos is also the co-author of the award-winning book, The Latino Question, Politics, Laboring Classes, and the Next Left. Dr. Jose Villagran is a former migrant farm worker turned advocate and researcher of migrant and seasonal farm workers. He has organized Mexican agricultural guest workers with the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, also known as FLOC, in North Carolina, and has worked with various farm worker advocacy groups in South Texas and Michigan, the sites of his doctoral dissertation. He attained a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from the University of Texas of Austin in May of 2019, and is currently a lecturer in Chicano and Latino studies at UW-Madison. And I must say that we are very fortunate to have Jose as a colleague here at UW-Madison. Dr. Almita A. Miranda is an assistant professor of geography in Chicano and Latino studies who specializes in race and gender, immigration, transnationalism, social movements, and critical Latinx ethnography and life histories in the US Midwest and Central Mexico. Professor Miranda's current book project, Living in Legal Limbo, is based on long-term ethnographic research examining the varied experience and apprehensions of citizenship, belonging, and displacement among Mexican mixed status families in Chicago and return migrants in Zacatecas, Mexico, since 2006 to the present. Her work examines not only the inner workings of the state, economy, and law, but also the varying resistance strategies and discourses produced from below. Her research has received funding from the National Science Foundation, the Winter Grin, and various fellowships from Dartmouth College, Brown University, and her alma mater, Northwestern University. As a native Chicagoan, Miranda has been invested in the local immigrant rights movement and has developed long-standing relationships with organizations like Centro Sin Fronteras, ICIRR, and two Mexican hometown associations. She is also one of the coordinators for the new Wisconsin Latinx History Collective with Professor Ramirez, myself, and Professor Arenas, aimed to document oral histories of Latinx communities in Wisconsin and make these publicly available at the Wisconsin Historical Society and through online formats. I am proud to be in community and in this space with these outstanding scholars and look forward to our conversation. So let's begin by talking about the first topic of conversation, theorize about and study migration from Latin America to the US. Professor Carlos?
I just wanted to make, like, I didn't know if that was your cue for me. Thank you very much for the introduction, Armando, and I'm glad to be in conversation with everyone here. So the way that we approach, the way that I approach in our collaborative book, The Latino Question, we approach migration is there's different sort of propositions about what causes migration. Some folks say it's because of social networks. Some folks say it's push-pull factors. And one of the things that we really try to look at is migration as a process that is cyclical. And particularly, we advance the work of Dr. Gil Gonzalez and others who talk about migration within the context of global capitalism. And particularly, the theory that we propose is the empire theory of migration. And it's I mean, we propose it, we expand upon some of the prior work. There's some foundational work with Mario Barrera, Dr. Gonzalez, Raul Fernandez, who take a look at the experiences of Latinoamericanos from the perspective of their role within the global capitalist sort of economy. And we can trace this back, people think of these different waves of, I'm talking about Mexican migration, as being different somehow. And we argue that there is some differences. There is, obviously policy differences, but like they're part of a cyclical process that really goes back to, 1823, when the Monroe Doctrine sort of was established, where, the United States really saw Latin America as its own personal backyard colony. It didn't formally colonize all of it the way that the other empires at the time were colonizing other countries, but we tend to forget about the fact that Mexico was to some degree colonized. They did actually take over half of the territory of Mexico, and we don't tend to think of the sort of that as the first Latin American intervention. And so, obviously in 1848, 1846 to 1848, the United States invades Mexico, takes over half of its land. And that really becomes the model for how the United States gets access to resources and begins a process of displacement that speeds up in the 1880s, really, when the United States starts to penetrate Mexico during the Porfiriato. And so that process becomes really the model, not just for Latin American intervention, but Latin American intervention then also becomes the model for intervention in all other parts of the world. It's really, what's occurred more recently in the Middle East is really just a continuation of that. And so in this process is sort of a cyclical process. While it began back then we can really look at Central American migration right now from the similar context that, you know, the United States in the like 1970s and 80s, you know, because of its intervention in these countries, created chaos that they are still have yet to recover from, that has been sort of created a political economy in these countries that is unsustainable. You know, it's basically implemented, even though they're no longer at war and they're no longer in sort of this, you know, they're living in this, I mean, you know, we can sort of argue about that and have a discussion, but it's forced them to basically produce, you know, its economy monoculture. They produce, you know, 2 or 3 palm oil, bananas, you know, coffee, and they're at the whims of the global economy, which causes their economies to, like, obviously not develop within itself. And so, you know, in terms of how we talk about migration, you know, all of that, like the push-pull theories and some of these other theories that help explain, that help elucidate a little bit of, you know, what goes on during the process of migration for us, doesn't really explain why. Like, you know, and it also simplifies a lot of really complex information. And I know that you and I have had conversations about, you know, what makes people get up and leave, right? And so I really like the way that, that, you know, we began this conversation by, you know, what causes migration, what causes folks to leave places that they call home. And it's only really dire consequences. And so within this larger context, people make decisions. Yeah, they make push-pull decisions, but they do so within the context of the fact that their economies in their own countries have been decimated by American global capitalism. And so, I mean, I don't know if you want me to elaborate, you want to have a conversation about that. You know, I can sort of go on, and I would prefer to have a conversation about what y'all think about this. Yeah.
Yeah, to elaborate on what Professor Carlos outlined for us, there's multiple factors or causes of migration. Used to go farther into the push-pull factors, there's the labor demands that are historically at the center of increased migration into the United States. Historically, there's been demands for migration from different Asian regions, including China and Japan, for instance. There's been migration demands from different European countries over the years, but most recently, that shifted when more restrictions on immigration were implemented in the 20th century to limit the number of people, or to limit immigration from China, for instance, the Chinese immigration, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then limitations on certain European countries. The labor demand or the labor supply was then coming from Latin America, Mexico in large numbers, but also other Latin American countries. And that resulted in a codependency, a binational codependency between Mexico and the United States, for instance, where Mexico depends on the United States to hire its citizens, and then Mexico, on the other hand, and the United States benefits from the labor, or depends on the labor to fill the labor holes that there are created in the United States, but also to fill these quote-unquote immigrant job sectors that had been designated for immigrant communities in the United States. And then Mexico depends on the United States for the remittances that these immigrants send, that are number one part of the Mexican economy today. The remittances. Go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah, I was going to say, I really like the way that you established this codependency, but I want to point out that it's a very uneven codependency, right? Oh, yeah. It's very high, I just want to clarify. I know that you know that, but it's this really uneven, like, you know, even in terms of its most current iteration since NAFTA, the trading relationship is massively uneven. In Mexico, Mexico's people don't benefit, but the capitalist class and the capitalist, you know, people that run the government there are the ones that benefit from that. People like Vicente Fox, obviously he ran Coca-Cola and became president eventually, but these folks are the ones that are benefiting. But it causes all kinds of internal, where it ends up it results in a situation in which Mexico, you know, 50% of the people are living in poverty. And so it's very uneven. I just wanted to point that out.
And I guess I would just like to take the time to, talk about my advisor's work, Martha Menchaca, cultural anthropologist from UT Austin, right, who in 2016 writes the book, The Politics of Dependency, and the way she actually frames this dependence, this unequal dependency that we're talking about between Mexico and the US is as an asymmetrical codependency, right, to sort of, I guess, package it a little bit more neatly, in which clearly the United States benefits by far more than Mexico does from these intricately tied economies. Of course, her focus is on the oil sector. So, and then more broadly speaking, if we were to expand the definition of energy, farm labor, right? And so these are the sort of two biggest extractions, if you will, that the U.S. Derives from Mexico and continues to maintain the U.S. while benefiting more still in somewhat of a dependent relationship, or not somewhat, but clearly in a dependent relationship with Mexico. And I guess, obviously, as I study farm labor, when we're talking specifically about the Midwest, the history of Latinx migration, which generally speaking, we're talking especially early on in the sort of early 20th century, we're talking about Mexicans for the most part, right, is for farm labor, right? The sort of work of historians like Dennis Valdez talk about this in Al Norte and Barrio Norteños. The idea here being that large commercial agriculture that's developing in the early 20th century in the Midwest was the magnet, if you will, that was pulling up Mexican labor into the region. There was a very clear understanding from early on, and so some of the places where this is most prevalent, if we're talking about the Midwest, is Michigan and Minnesota. These are places that established particularly large sugar beet production in the region in the early 20th century. But at the same time, in the sort of World War I era, there was a pretty clear understanding that they were going to struggle to get labor. There had been for a while now in the U.S. in terms of the farm labor scene, a lot of workers from Eastern and Southern European descent, and during World War I, that came to a stop, or at least to a pause, right, because of the tensions going on in this global war, largely based in Europe. And so as commercial agriculture is developing, specifically, again, the sugar beet industry replacing what had previously been largely lumber industries as well as grains, right? The upper Midwest was often referred to as the breadbasket of America in the late 1800s. But we basically see the emergence of sugar beet and other commercial crops take this massive labor pool. And from the very beginning, it was pretty clear that labor was going to be the biggest problem in developing commercial agriculture infrastructure here in the Midwest. And so not to overly center farm labor, I have other interests, I promise you guys, but there is undeniably a central role that farm labor needs to play in terms of getting quote brown people up here into the Midwest.
So what we're discussing here is a migration of labor, something that's intentionally created. So it's not necessarily a natural phenomena that we're discussing with regards to migration itself. From what I'm hearing, we're discussing an interdependence between specifically right now Mexico in the U.S. and the non-capitalization of labor itself in Mexico, because that's one of its key exporters to the U.S. Almita, I know that you've done work around this non-capitalization of labor in Mexico and development of local economies in Mexico, especially in Zacatecas. Could you speak to that for a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to follow up on some of the points that Alfredo, Marla, and Jose have made, because I do think it's important to, as Alfredo mentioned, contextualize these migrations during their different periods, although that many of these are cyclical, right? And he said that. I tend to follow the work of Nicholas de Genova, as well as David Harvey, in explaining the importance of historical political economy in terms of the periods of migration that were an important part that start to see developing throughout the 20th century is the establishing of transnational communities and families. So as the US is recruiting Mexican labor through different periods, whether it's during the World War I period, during the Bracero era, or afterwards, you do see families and multi-generational migrants starting to be established in terms of the networks. So in my work with mixed status families, many of my interlocutors migrated during the 1990s, during a period when the US and Mexico, well, Mexico really began to adopt a neoliberal economic model in partnership with the US. And one of the most cited policies is NAFTA. That in itself created an uneven sort of marketplace for many of my interlocutors who were local farmers who used to produce maize and beans for profit. After the establishing of NAFTA and just the lack of federal price regulations, they could no longer afford to make a living with that. So they recruited to migration. But in my investigation, I would do sort of family histories, and many of them had former braceros in their families. Many of them had parents who had migrated in the 1970s and 80s. So for them, they were already third generation migrants. So again, this shows that these previous patterns continue to follow us up until the 90s and so on. What we do see that's something that's distinct about this more current or contemporary undocumented population, particularly from Mexico from the 90s, 2000s, is that they've become a settled undocumented population. So whereas before we would see some families go back and forth and being able to physically go and sort of continue their transnational migration, now because of more restrictive immigration policies since the 90s, during the Bill Clinton years, 1996 era, we do see them being less able to actually cross the border. It's much more expensive, it's more deadlier, and many of them have established families in the US, most of which are of mixed status. So when I think about how we theorize or how we study migration, one of my biggest concerns is that even now, as we promote or push for immigration reform, we are still not getting at the root of what's causing these migrations and this uneven development between countries like the US and Mexico. So what we do or push for to actually make migration more accessible, right, through so as not to force entire millions of people to have to live in the shadows, but then also how do we support these national economies in places like Mexico, in rural areas like Zacatecas, where if nothing changes, they will continue to migrate. This is a last resort for them in order to provide for their families. Sorry, I think I did too much.
Fantastic.
I think it's
Professor
good.
Miranda. Go ahead, Professor.
I'm going to add one more thing on Professor Miranda's point, that there's something to be said about the benefits for nation states to keep undocumented immigration or undocumented immigrants undocumented, right? There's a labor exploitation benefit that comes from not granting a path to legal citizenship or legal residency and then eventually US citizenship, that you can exploit that labor and then you can also remove it. You can deport that labor when it's no longer needed. And so that's a big incentive, a capitalist incentive at the cost of immigrant families and workers, right? That also Mexico benefits from that. That Mexico benefits from the remittances that these workers send, right? So that both nations are benefiting from immigrant families and are having a big incentive without protecting its citizens on either side of the border.
Thank you. So it sounds like that, we've gotten to this point. I'm moving the conversation along, Alfredo, looking at our time. So I haven't heard of any unified grand theory that explains migration, but it does sound like we're pointing to this idea that labor and labor exploitation is at the center, at least of the case of Mexico migration patterns. And it's from what I hear is that it's a migration that's generationally linked, that's conditioned by U.S. foreign policy towards Mexico. And is this what I'm hearing from you panelists?
I would just throw in that Puerto Rico occupies as well a similar history, so we're not just being exclusive to Mexico in that regard.
And I would add that the Central American migration has another very more complicated history as well. So while much of their migration can be labor, a lot of it has to do with military interventions from the 1980s to the present, actually, as well as now the booming drug industry, right, from Mexico to Central America, that's also creating very violent conditions that people now have to flee from. So.
For me, there's two parts of.
And in
no, go ahead, Professor.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say for me, there's two parts of this. So the labor is obviously one that's very key, but it's also how you displace that labor. What causes that labor to be able to migrate? And this is where I like Professor Miranda's contextualization that, you know, at the height of NAFTA, you know, 600 rural folks were migrating because they couldn't compete with American corn. And so this is what and then, you know, if you go back to the 1880s during the Porfiriato, it was, you know, the fact that, you know, Porfirio Diaz had given land to American corporations, had given land for the railroads, had given land, you know, for the mining, for cattle grazing. And so it's the displacement then makes it really easy for the labor to be imported. And even the thing about agriculture too is that the type of labor that's needed, it changes generationally, like you all have pointed to. So even though Mexican migration continues in terms of, you know, who does our farm work, that the type of Mexican that's been doing it has changed. So it's gone from northern Mexicans to now it's starting to move into like southern territory, and even Central Americans are starting to be imported, because once you get here, farm labor is a one generation type thing. People don't, you know, people want their kids to a better, you know, it's not paid very well. It's completely exploitable. And so it needs to replenish itself. And so for me, it's the resources piece. In the context of Mexico, it's been largely labor, but in the context of Central America, especially since we're seeing the caravans, a lot of that resources and access, you know, for the Panama Canal, for you know, Nicaragua and the other, you know, we call it banana republics, a very derogatory term, because, you know, all that they want is the resources from there. There's a lot of palm oil, like I said, coffee and bananas, but yeah.
This conversation has me really excited for many reasons. One of the reasons, I see a lot of my students here. And so, you know, I assigned the work of Gilbert in my class, you know, and I know Professor Ibarra and Professor Carlos are both profoundly impacted by the work of Gilbert Gonzalez. And just really quickly, I want to throw in that, you know, he quotes William Rosecrans, right, an ambassador to Mexico from the United States, railroad pioneer, who said, let's create a virtual economic colony of Mexico. And so that's the way, I think that's been the sort of prevailing way of contextualizing Mexico, U.S. interest in Mexico. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Gilbert Gonzalez, as well as to, you know, highlight that this isn't something that we're pulling out of thin air. It's something that, in fact, is by design, and we can see that evident in the words of its pioneers.
And one, like I'll say one other thing, and one of the things that also I think is important to understand in this whole process is that the United States, having a history of the ideology, white supremacy, extended, for them, there is no difference between Mexico and the rest of Latin America in terms of their foreign policy. For them, it's just brown people that they can use, exploit their land, exploit their labor. And to the degree that the current outgoing president actually thought that Guatemala was a state of Mexico. He actually thought that. He said that publicly. And obviously for us, we understand that there's a huge difference. Every state and every country has a different history. But in terms of how the United States deals with them, it's important to note that there is no difference. It's just brown people to exploit.
Yeah, I'd like to actually then also tie together to Professor Marla's point earlier about the sort of deportability of Mexican workers that makes them stand out, because in fact, as I referenced earlier, Puerto Ricans were also brought over for labor, right, during World War II era, for example. But one of the big problems that farmers reported, for example, with Puerto Rican laborers throughout largely the East Coast, northern states and the East Coast, is that by virtue of colonization, right, they were in fact US citizens, and therefore they can leverage, right, legal rights and complaints against exploitation on the job, and ultimately they were deemed an unworthy labor force for US agriculture because they weren't exploitable to the point that Mexicans were, because they weren't deportable.
So that's a really interesting topic that you just bring in, is the connection between Puerto Rican labor to the Midwest, right? Especially to the Chicago area, to Milwaukee, and to the rural areas of Wisconsin. We know that there's some relationships that bring large numbers of Puerto Rican workers to work during the migrant season as well, in the canneries or in different parts of agriculture. So this is something that we see here locally with regards to those long-standing relationships. I just wanted to add to the Rosecrans quote that you were bringing. He also says, we no longer need to conquer countries militarily. We conquer them economically. So that's part of the premise of the whole Gonzalez thought of how to explain migration within these economic satellites, America for Americans, right? So I want to continue our conversation to move on, because eventually we're going to focus on Wisconsin itself, but we have scholars of law or the impacts of law and citizenship here with us. Can you speak a little bit about how law impacts not just the migration process, but the immigrant once they come to the U.S.?
Marta, did you want to start, because you're more of a historian, and then I can follow?
I'm sorry, Armando, can you repeat that question? I couldn't hear the last part.
So the impacts of law in the way that we conceptualize citizenship in this country on both immigration itself, but also on the immigrant once they arrive in the U.S.
Oh, right. Yeah, so I study the history of Mexican repatriation, focusing on the experiences during the Great Depression of Mexican Americans who were obviously US citizens, but still caught up in the removal rates and mass repatriation rates. And it took some of them 2 or 3, even 4 decades to be able to come back and reclaim their US citizenship, right? And I always like to emphasize the fact that Latinos, or Mexicans more specifically, have been in the United States, have a long-rooted presence in the United States, as Professor Carlos mentioned, since 1848, with the annexation of almost half of the Mexican former territory into the United States, and those states eventually became, or those territories eventually became states. And with those regions, in those regions were also Mexican people, right? Some of who were able to gain US citizenship, but the vast majority didn't. So that is to say that even in 1848, some Mexicans were integrated as US citizens. Those who didn't, weren't able to claim US citizenship and stay in the United States had children and grandchildren and further generations of US citizen children, right? And then the question becomes, then why is it that Mexicans do not have such strong political power if they have a strong presence in the United States with a long genealogy of US citizens, right? And my answer to that, my research, what is looking at, that citizenship has been disrupted over the generations, right? That with every mass deportation efforts, then we disrupt families from having the ability to transfer their citizenship over generations, and diminishes their political power. When in the 1930s, when US citizens were expelled en masse because of the Great Depression, they formed families in Mexico, and they had their own children and even sometimes grandchildren in Mexico. Some of who are now coming into the United States as undocumented immigrants, even when they have claims to US citizenship because a mother or father or grandparent was a US citizen. So that disruption impacts or limits the political power and the political voices that Mexican immigrants can have. And then in the other spectrum, even for people who are coming into the United States as undocumented immigrants, the lack of action by the legislature to implement immigration reforms to allow people to establish a path to citizenship also limits their political power. That again, I think goes hand in hand with the ability to exploit labor and have it being removable and disposable.
And thank you so much for that. And then in more recent decades, and when I say recent, I'm thinking 1970s forward, we've seen how undocumented migration in particular has been largely defined as unauthorized. And partly that happened after the ending of the Bracero era. You know, the labor was still recruited, but now people cross the border to come and work in the farms. But we haven't really seen an immigration reform that has permitted a legalization program since 1986. In fact, this is IRCA, Immigration Reform and Control Act, which ended up legalizing 2.3 million Mexican formerly undocumented immigrants. And in fact, my own parents were part of that. Otherwise, they would still be undocumented. And so we've seen that, you know, the US has taken this approach of not only putting more funding in terms of border security and closing down, as they say, the borders, but also passing legislation that has become much more restrictive and has made it even harder for undocumented immigrants already in the US to actually legalize their status. Among my interlocutors who are of mixed status, I have, there are couples that are married to US citizens, but because of 1996 legislations and the specifics of their cases, they're not able to legalize their status. And so you maintain an undocumented population. And as the other speakers have said, you know, in a very purposeful way. The other thing about citizenship and law in the US is that anyone who's born in the US or to US citizen parents have birthright citizenship. And so this is where we see again the formation of these mixed status families. So undocumented parents can have US born citizen children because of the 14th Amendment. And even that has been already a discourse that in the public media, people have tried to challenge birthright citizenship as you know, illegitimate or whatnot, even though it is part of our Constitution. And so these debates over citizenship are very politically driven. And in fact, many people argue that, you know, politicians are sometimes against any kind of immigration reform that would legalize our unauthorized population, because eventually they could become citizens and thus voting members. And so that is another way of sort of maintaining them in limbo.
I guess I want to add just that in my research, I was interviewing farmers in Michigan, for example, during the Trump Trump candidacy in 2015 for the 2016 election. And they found them, the ones I was talking to were Trump supporters because they felt he was, you know, a patriot, nationalistic, things that they liked, but they also felt like he supported deregulatory culture, which was perhaps going to make business easier for them. But on the other hand, when I would ask them, right, about, well, what about your workers? They admitted that that was a big worry, that in terms of Trump's harsh rhetoric on immigration, they were in fact worried about being able to sustain a sufficient labor force, because farmers are pretty well aware that the majority of their workers are, you know, either migrants from Mexico, but you know, but also largely undocumented. And what I got to say is that, and this is just sticking to the agricultural sector, the work around this sort of contradiction, if you will, as of late has been the increased use, dramatically increased use of Mexican guest workers through the H-2A visa program, which looks a lot like the Bracero program did in the mid-20th century during the World War II era. It gives you a group of guest workers that can come into the region without fear that they are going to settle in the region or be any kind of a political or social burden, right? It alleviates those contradictions of being pro-deregulation, but, you know, being anti-immigrant that we see a lot of people stuck in. And what I just want to close off on that point in saying is that A lot of previous migrants that had come into the Midwest for farm labor, whether be it that they were undocumented and or a mix of legal statuses, ultimately were able to settle out into the region in a way that guest workers cannot. And so what I'm thinking is going to happen moving forward is that we don't see it a lot in Wisconsin, and I can get into that later, but in Michigan, where they're starting to use over 10, 15,000 HJ guest workers, is guest workers are not very likely to settle out. They can't. They have to go back to Mexico. Now they can if they jump their post and now they want to live as undocumented peoples. But what I really think may happen with the guest worker program is a slowing down, if you will, of Latinos settling out in the Midwest. At least that's something I'm thinking about could really affect settlement patterns moving forward. And not to, sorry Armando if I'm jumping us too far ahead, but I guess I just wanted to bridge off of Almita's point there.
So no, you're not jumping ahead, and thank you. The idea behind, you know, the way that we use law and the way that we define citizenship, who belongs, who doesn't belong, right, is something that's been part of this ideology and practice of cultural racialization, right? And when we're talking about labor, we're talking that, you know, nationwide, or at least in the Southwest and here in Wisconsin, that the majority of agricultural workers are Latino immigrants, with the majority of them being undocumented, right? So the question is what is that process that's taking place or has taken place that has created these dynamics of a racialized workforce? And how does that fit to this idea that at least in the case of Mexican immigrants for the last 100 years fit to this what Alfredo has talked about, this empire theory of migration as something to explain mass labor migration and integration into different industries, which leads subsequent to generational settlement by the second plus and beyond generations. So that's where I'm trying to get there. And so let's move on to that idea of racialization. Do you all see processes of racialization in your research?
Yeah, I can start. So I build on the work of Natalia Molina and May Nai that talk about how the experiences, so Natalia Molina talks about relational race experiences. So what a specific racial group experience can be recycled and experienced decades later by another immigrant group, right? And May Nai talks about the suspect other, right? Or the alien citizen, that even if you are a US citizen, oftentimes your ethnicity or your race will await your citizenship. So you always be suspected of not belonging or not being a US citizen. Other scholars have theorized about second-class citizenship, like Almaguer, for instance, right? And so we have a genealogy of scholarship that documents these experiences of otherness, regardless of legal status, on different time periods, right? And it is exactly that what that allowed 60% of those people removed, that is estimated to be about 1 million people during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, that even though they were US citizens, they were still being removed. And it is that suspicion, that racial profiling that allowed them to be removed, right? That when immigration raids happened, if people pass as Mexican, that's all it took for them to be transported into trains or other transportation modes and being removed in mass without an opportunity to prove their citizenship or produce documentation to prove the legal right to reside in the United States. Yeah, go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah, I was gonna bring it sort of forward that process continues today. Like, you know, I was in a conversation with some migrant scholars at Cal State Long Beach one time, you know, and I have some scholars who are like, not all immigrants are Mexican. I'm like, yeah, but the ones that they're targeting, like ICE is specifically targeting, you know, brown communities, you know, Mexican and Central American communities. Like, they're not, you know, to the degree that they're in Boston. Boston has, you know, 600,000 undocumented immigrants from Europe. They're not targeting those communities. They're targeting like racialized brown communities. And so you know, I obviously understand there's African undocumented folks, there's undocumented folks from all over the world, but because of the history of who has provided that particular type of labor historically, it hasn't always been brown folks. I also see racialization on the other end, where you know, people say, oh, only Mexican workers are the ones willing to do that work. Well, historically, that's actually not true. We know that African Americans have done that work. We know that, you know, poor white people have done that work. You know, and so, but it is targeted just because of I would say it's a geographic thing too, that, you know, because Mexico is so close, Mexico has always been, you know, the United States, when it needs laborers, has always been able to reach in there and say, hey, we need some workers. And it's the proximity, I think, has an effect.
Right. It's not only so close, but it's in an economically disparate situation. And so in 2005, I was organizing farm workers in North Carolina with guest workers with the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, as Armando mentioned earlier. And this is when it first dawned on me. I was a 19-year-old former farm worker at the time, young college student. And I was talking to one of the farmers off the side of the street as we were like talking about conditions of the farm workers. I was actually there kind of inspecting him with the Farm Labor Union. And then he starts to give me like this flattery, as is very common, right? Like, oh, you know, please don't report me for my infractions. And he goes, boy, I love these Mexicans. They're the hardest workingest folks I've ever seen. And, you know, I think it can be really easy to fall into this, oh, this is somehow some type of flattery, you know, we have a culture that values work ethic. But really what's happening, I think, in that statement is racialization, right? It's an essentializing of Mexicans as the ideal farm worker without regard to the political, social, and economic context in which they're working that generally cause them to sacrifice their health, work long hours, right, et cetera, perhaps not push back when rights are infracted upon because they fear deportation. Other scholars since then that I've interacted with have mentioned this point, right? Sociologist Marta Maldonado, anthropologist Seth Holmes, they talk about the ways, especially when we're looking at farm workers, in which farmers tend to essentialize the Mexican, right, as the ideal farm worker by actually pointing to physical characteristics. So rather than pointing to what we are discussing is the elephant in the room, the economic, political, social desperations, they point to, hey, look, Mexicans are short, they're low to the ground, they value agriculture, culturally speaking, and you know, it's a way I think oftentimes that is used by farmers to justify their exploitation, right? This is something that, in fact, my workers enjoy doing, which I think is incredibly dangerous, and I'll tell you right now in 2020 is something that is alive and well.
Yeah, and this really is it's a complication of that whole narrative that we see during, you know, these narratives of we do the jobs nobody else will, which is also, I think, something that furthers that racialization. It's more of people do these jobs because out of desperation and the need to survive, which is flipping that script, but also going back to you know, Seth Holmes, this medical doctor and anthropologist. He has a titled chapter in one of his books that's called "Oaxacans Like to Work Bent Over," right? Which is the frame that the growers use to describe the workers in their berry fields. That's part. Wow. Go ahead, Marla.
Yeah. I want to also bring the racialization more to the present, right? As Professor Carlos began to do. So, and also Professor Villagrán elaborated, right? I want to take us back to Arizona during the Arpaio policies, right? Where the racial profiling was at a height that anybody who passed as a brown person, as a Mexican or a Latino, could be questioned and be stopped and interrogated and had to produce documentation to prove the legal right to be in the United States, right? That, as Professor Carlos pointed out, white people or even Latinos who are white passing, like my husband, for instance, right? They're not suspected even if they're undocumented, right? There is this racialization that is linked to phenotype, that we imagine brown bodies as always undocumented.
Yeah, I want to continue on that because even in cases like Chicago, I mean, we have one of the largest undocumented Polish communities. and they're not the ones being targeted by, internal enforcement policies. It is Little Village, which is predominantly Mexican and Latino. It is Pilsen. It is these largely Latino communities that are the ones who are experiencing massive raids. And then I also wanted to jump into the issue of law, because oftentimes in a more contemporary context, people claim, these immigration enforcement policies, these laws are not racist, right? They're just the law. So there's a way in which we're also kind of murking, the law as being neutral or unbiased. And we know historically this hasn't been the case in the U.S. Immigration law and policy has always been racially based. Even now, in more contemporary times, there is a preference system in our immigration law, but that is very class-based. So people from Mexico, it's really challenging for them to get work-based visas unless they're, PhDs, right? Unless they're, among the elite. And we can also see this across other types of countries. So the people that are being excluded are largely poor working classes of color. And this can include not only Latin Americans, but also African migrants as well. So there's a way in which the law is being used to, as Marla mentioned, racially profile people. And I know Jose and I have had conversations that, around the border regions, it is a common practice to profile and ask for documentation from U.S. citizens who are living in these areas. But whereas we would see this in the 80s and 90s, now we're seeing this profiling also in the interior of the U.S., right? And this is something that Gilberto Rosas has talked about in his concept of thickening of the borderlands, that we're seeing all the surveillance and policing across the U.S. in communities of color.
I want to add to that a little bit. I think one of the things that animates that is this political economic question. Like, why are we passing these really restrictive laws that aren't really about just deporting people? They're about putting people into a system of concentration, detention industrial complex, right? And so it's this really interesting, industry that has developed that is about housing immigrants. So the prison industry, when it saw its profits sort of like tail off when people stopped imprisoning, they said, hey, we think there's a place here for us to continue to make money. And they've made billions of dollars off of the detention of immigrants. And so you end up with this really backward logic that, we're not going to try to curb immigration because we actually need undocumented people in the United States, one, to do the labor. Right, we know that part. We know that we need undocumented immigrants to do the cheap, exploitable, vulnerable labor that we want, that we can displace whenever we want. Like, that's the piece. But we also need them so we can put them into the detention system so that these companies can make billions of dollars, that they get contracts from the government. And so you have sometimes what seems two competing places where if you detain too many immigrants, then the farmers don't have enough workers. But the system is like that. It seems like these two are opposed to each other, the detention system with the agricultural industry, but it's actually not. It works in perfect symbiosis because they only detain is like just enough to keep the prisons or the detention centers full, but at the same time, make sure that the farmers have enough workers as well.
So policing and profiteering and people as commodities within what Jose has called detention capitalism. I'm going to shift really to a different topic right now because I want to catch you all off guard a little and talk a little bit about what's going on in Mexico right now and in how it's policing, migrants from Central America and from other countries as well that are using Mexico as an entry point into the US. I just want to hear some big thoughts about what you think about what's going on in Mexico.
There's a fascinating and important scholarship line being developed in the past few years that examines Mexico as an extension of the US-Mexico border that is extended to the Guatemala-Mexico border, right? In Mexico now, it is a hand of the United States to deter immigration from Central America. And then under the Trump administration, with a new policy for asylum applications, where refugees have to remain in Mexico while their application is being processed, right? That's another example how the border is extended into a different country, right? So it's no longer national policy, it's foreign policy being treated as national policy, right? So we are yet to understand these dynamics because are more recent and because we are still studying them. But I want to point out the complicity of the Mexican government in this displacement as well, and the discrimination that happens in Mexico, right? That as much as Mexicans are discriminated in the United States, and that there's this Mexican or brown labor sectors, in Mexico there's also these Central American labor sectors, right? And discrimination and displacement that is very similar to what we experience here.
Yeah, actually, thank you, Marla, for bringing that up. And again, not to always overly focus on agriculture, right? But technically, right, like many of the northern Mexican migrant farm workers who enter into the United States, they also leave voids in farm labor in Mexico. And we've seen a lot of research look at how a lot of those voids are filled by southern Mexicans and Central Americans. So you end up having a chain of upward migration of farm workers continuing to fill voids where they exist. And we got to talk about that. I think the other side of the coin in terms of what's going on in Mexico is this issue that we started with of dependency, right? Of this asymmetrical codependency between the two nations. And so when we see, for example, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador recently, right, sort of appeased Donald Trump's request of Mexico furthering their restrictions down on the border. When I talk to my peers and colleagues in Mexico, they say, what do you want Mexico to do? Their economy collapses if Trump is in fact serious about some of his threats in terms of affecting the trade market. And we see that Trump was serious about that stalemate with China. And you know, I think for a lot of Mexicans, the worry, and especially policymakers is who we're talking about here, the worry is that the money's going to stop trickling in, right? And of course, as we've been mentioning, there are people who benefit from that trickling in of money, whether we're talking about the remittances or otherwise.
And I think this also has implications here in the United States. This is one of the things that leads to a lot of tension between the Central American community and the Mexican community. The fact that, you know, Central Americans have to migrate through Mexico in this sort of controversial, like this tension, where, you know, like Mexico is treating them this way, and they get here. And so it's sort of, you know, it goes back to that dependency, you know. I mean, in Latin American, you know, countries in general have done this. I mean, there's that famous saying that, you know, when the United States sneezes, you know, the Latin American countries get sick, because, I mean, the economy, because there is that dependency. So I think thinking about, you know, the question that, you know, some of you all posed earlier is, how do we end it? I think these countries have to take hold of their own economies and have to figure out a way not to become so dependent on the United States. And I think the trade wars that Trump started with China, I think that would have been an excellent opportunity for some Central American countries to begin to explore an economic relationship outside of the empire. Like, you know, how can they start, you know, diversifying their economies so that isn't the case, so that when, you know, Trump wants, you know, more restrictive, you know, policing of Central American migration, the Mexico doesn't have to comply.
Well, thank you. Those are... Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that the journey of Central Americans through Mexico, as you pointed out, I mean, this is something that many scholars are looking into. Like Wendy Vaught just published her book on that. But there have been sort of two parts of Mexico's responses, and I'm talking about Mexican citizens. On the one hand, you do have important sort of organizations and work that is aimed to provide humanitarian relief to Central Americans as they're making their journey north. Like Las Patronas is a very famous female-led groups, right? That try to provide food and shelter. There's a lot of migrant shelters throughout the U.S.-Mexico border on the Mexican side. On the other hand, you also see an increased security on, you know, Mexican immigration officials targeting and looking for Central Americans, right? And anyone that may look. So there's a way also of racializing, or, you know, even through language, like dialect, right? Hearing and making sure that someone is a Mexican national or is not someone from a Central American country. But in the context of 2006 forward, we also see criminal organizations who target Central American migrants and will hold them for ransom. And this was a fight that, you know, the Calderón, Peña Nieto administrations have had to deal with, and now AMLO as well. But this issue of dependency comes up in terms of aid packages. So as the US negotiates and tries to so-called work with Mexico to combat, you know, the drug wars in Mexico, they're also putting sort of protocols or restrictions and recommendations of how Mexico should police their southern border as well. So there's a way in which there's an attempt to structure Mexico's immigration system similar to the US, and the exchange is, you know, aid and I guess financial compensation in terms of trying to fight criminal organizations in Mexico.
Well, thank you so much. We've got approximately 20 minutes. I want to leave about 15 minutes for questions. I know that I received a couple in the chat, but now let's focus a little bit on the Midwest, right? So we have folks immigrants from Latin America that have been coming to the United States for generations, mostly to the coast, the Southwest, the East Coast, to Florida. But now we have large numbers of folks of immigrants that are choosing that the Midwest is becoming a choice destination of folks to come directly. Why would somebody, or what are the dynamics that are drawing new arrivals and their families to places like Wisconsin?
I can begin this question. Historically, it has been labor demands as well, right? We know that during World War II and World War I, there were agricultural demands throughout the country, including the Midwest, Wisconsin specifically, right? And as of 1925, it is estimated that about 9,000 people of Mexican descent live in Wisconsin, mainly in Milwaukee. And that number then decreased with the Great Depression and the mass removals that happened during that period, but then increased again during World War II, right? So that's one sector of agriculture labor demands. But then also as immigrants from Latin America came into the United States and settled in the southwest of the United States, California, Texas, New Mexico, and so on, as labor opportunities open up, or they learn about labor opportunities elsewhere, they began migrating. So we know that in Chicago, most of the Mexicans, historically speaking, who arrived to Chicago were coming through Texas, that had settled in Texas and then made their way to Chicago, right? And those communities, or the sense of those communities, now are moving elsewhere. So as the more contemporaneously, as the cost of living increases in places like Chicago, for instance, then Latinos are immigrating to areas that are cheaper, that have lower cost of living, such as Wisconsin. So we see an increased migration, internal migration from Chicago to, or Illinois in general, to Wisconsin, right? So that's how we get a bigger population of Latinos in Wisconsin.
I think, you know, I thought it was that Wisconsin state motto was come for the labor and stay for the cheese curds, you know, but I'm just kidding. What I wanted to jump on that point, Marla, that I think is very interesting, because what I noticed when I conducted research in Michigan, I was largely interviewing farmers and farm workers in Southwest Michigan. Of course, the proximity to Chicago and Southwest Michigan, right, is really close. And so what I ran across was a group of farmers who actually were not the farm workers. They were not the seasonal hired hands. They were in fact the owners of small blueberry farming operations in Southwest Michigan, who were a group of very unified Mexican farmers who were originally from Michoacan, the state of Michoacan, who had then moved to Chicago years ago, had worked these sort of really, I actually interviewed one of these farmers for my research. So I have that all on file, who worked sort of overtime shifts and night shifts and told me about all of the squalor that he and his family lived in Chicago while they were just sort of making it. And he says, my big dream is to recreate my agricultural lifestyle that I had in rural Michoacan, but up here. And what I needed to do was save money in Chicago. And then I came to Michoacan del Norte, Michigan, right? I mean, it's the same word, Michoacan and Michigan. And he, in fact, was a part of this group of very interesting group. They're all from Chicago, originally from Michoacan, and they're all settling in Southwest Michigan. So while my field of expertise is more in Michigan, it speaks to your point of these sort of areas of proximity to these urban centers that become very, sort of unlivable and unsustainable for many of the people in these communities. And I also think, however, to add this point, that the increase in Mexican farmers is actually beneficial to help combat some of the exploitation of the workers. And so when I interviewed workers that work for these Michoacanos, they like it more than other places they've worked. That's very early on, so I'm not trying to make any sort of sweeping conclusions about that, but it's interesting to pay attention to moving forward. Thank you.
So we've got several questions, and I want to move us towards that question. I wish we had 5 hours to have this conversation. I'm learning so much. But given that we just finished the 2020 presidential election and, the rhetoric around immigrants and specifically, immigrants from Central America, from Mexico and South America now as well, there's a lot of, seems to be hope from the immigrant community here in the United States with the change in administration. So one of the questions comes from Alberto Vargas. He says, any thoughts or comments on DACA under Biden-Harris administration? Do you foresee a comprehensive immigration reform or more piecemeal approach? Does most of substantive change happen in Congress?
Yeah, so unlike the Trump administration or Trump himself, who ran on the premise that he's going to increase immigration restrictions, right, and deportations, Biden and Harris run on this promise for immigration reform as well. So it was one component of their campaign. But we know that the Obama right, they also had a component of immigration reform that it wasn't materialized for different factors, but also that the Obama-Biden administration did not press as much as they could have pressed, I think. And then we had what has become known as this band-aid solution, temporary solution, DACA, right? That now is being contested in court, was heard by the US Supreme Court. And so Biden has promised to defend DACA, has promised to implement an immigration plan. In one of the presidential debates, the question of immigration came up. And Biden said that he's going to propose an immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform bill, under which all DACA beneficiaries are going to be included, so that there could be a path towards citizenship, right? Whether that is going to happen or be supported by a divided Congress and Senate is yet to be seen, right? It's not up to the president alone. It has to be supported by both the Senate and Congress.
But one of the other things also is that we understand that on day one, from we hear the Biden-Harris administration, is that most, or if not all, of the executive orders that President Trump implemented will be negated. And so that's one of the things. The other thing that we also hear is about a documented type program for all unauthorized folks in the country, not just the ones that qualify right now as well. But let's move on, and we have I think a really important question for you all, and it's from a student, from Ana Bermudez. And she asks, what advice would you give to undergraduate students who want to continue challenging these harmful narratives about immigrants, perhaps through their careers, but otherwise as well?
I can sort of maybe start that conversation, and it actually relates to the last question. I think one of the problems in terms of policies, like obviously the Senate is going to matter, all of that, like what happens with immigration reform, even the Supreme Court, which is heavily tilted against, you know, any type of, you know, any executive order that the government passes, it's gonna, you know, it's gonna be challenged. But part of it is also that like the Democrats are really bad at like having their own conversation. Trump says build a wall, and the Democrat response is, well, let's just strengthen the border. And it's always on their terms. I think we have to start saying amnesty, not just reform, like just amnesty. Like, let's actually start saying and talking about the things that we actually want, not just the things that we think they can give us. And so if you're a young person who's interested in immigration politics, you know, we have to start having a conversation about, you know, humanizing these folks, you know, and just, why not just say it? And, you know, because people are scared to say it, but people are scared to say it because nobody's talking about it. At some point we have to start saying amnesty so that the conversation can be on our terms. And so, you know, as part of this, you know, if you're interested in immigration, there's a lot of organizations that do awesome work. Like, I'm out in California, I'm not in the Midwest, but out here there's, you know, like the Long Beach Immigrants Rights Coalition is doing great work. In LA, there's all kinds. I know in your area, I know Voces de la Frontera does amazing work with, you know, immigrant communities, and I'm sure there's a lot more. But there's a lot of places that need young people to help, you know, do education around, you know, how these policies affect folks. But yeah.
I think that, Anna, great question. I think you need to respond. Unfortunately, you know, with all of this material we're talking about, with the context, I'll show my age a little bit here and quote Mexican rock band Molotov, right? Aunque nos hagan la fama de que somos vendedores de las drogas que sembramos, ustedes son consumidores, right? Like, ultimately, and so what I said, right, Mexicans are made famous for the drugs that they harvest, but in fact, it's you, United States, who consumes them. And so I think the focus on the side of U.S. consumption is the most powerful tool we have on a side from humanization. I think at the basic level, right, a move away from the civil rights discourse of the mid-20th century to a 21st century discourse of human rights is very powerful and effective. But if we're going to, you know, sort of frame this along sort of economic terms, then there is something to be said about U.S. consumption, right, of, you know, cheap labor, et cetera, oil, drugs, et cetera. And it's not, I think it's not useful to get stuck in a blame game, but this nuance is so desperately missing. In fact, and I'll be quiet here, I'm just so happy to be talking about all of this with you guys, because sometimes you feel like you're talking to a wall, or you know what I'm saying, in terms of the way immigration discourse is generally had. So it's not super easy, Anna, but you know, I know, and you know, you're my student, so great question, but I know you have capacity to offer the type of nuance that is needed.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I just like to add something really quickly. Yeah, I mean, in any of the efforts, or whether they be local organizations or sort of electoral politics, really trying to advocate for immigrant rights in all aspects. I mean, a lot of people right now are talking about Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, but just know that undocumented immigrants were not included in that. And so there's ways in which whatever we pass that is somewhat progressive, you know, we're constantly excluding these communities. And the issue of undocumented migration does not only affect the immigrant, but their you know, their family networks, their communities. So we're really talking about millions and millions of people that are have a direct invested interest in getting any kind of not only legalization program, but actual equal treatment, you know, under the law and labor rights.
And I just want to say real quick before we move on, Armando, that we know that change, real change happens from the ground up, right? That it is through organizing. Any immigration reform that has been successful in the United States is because communities and organizers came together to really demand those changes and lobbying, right? So I'm really glad that new organizations are happening here at UW-Madison. Somebody said in the chat, Claire, there's a new organization called Advocates for Immigrant Rights that is having their first meeting tomorrow. So yes, organize, and more power to you, students that are coming together, having these conversations. Contact your representatives, right? Organize marches, organize support, and it is through your voices that change will happen. You are carrying us on to the next change that we'll see in this country.
Well, thank you all. And there's many questions that are being posed in the chat section, and unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them. But they're all very important. Like I said, I wish we had more time. But there is one question that I want to finalize this conversation with, and it's a question that asks about diversity within the Latino community, and not just the diversity, but the commonalities that Latinos, Latinas, Latinx communities, or however we wish to define ourselves, from across Latin America have. What are those commonalities, and how can you build solidarity amongst those commonalities?
We have shared histories, right? And we have more in common than we have than not. And I think we forget the struggles that different communities have gone through and overcome over the years, and that we have more power when we unite. That it is to the interest of people in power to divide us, right? This division between Latinos and Black workers, for instance, the Latinos are stealing jobs from African Americans. That's a tactic of division to then control, right, the masses. But if we inform ourselves and we realize that both Latinos and African Americans are suffering from the same types of oppression, and then come together and organize and mobilize and propose change and action for change, then that we can begin to see that change taking place. It is only when we overcome our differences to work across communities that we can then implement real change.
Is anybody here hearing David Roediger in their head and Wages of Whiteness, that 1991 book, that classic about how the sort of white working class really was the sort of most gung-ho invested in whiteness because it's what actually kept them above Black people, right? And so even though their economic situations were very similar, these are the sort of gung-ho whites that emerged in this competition of the working classes. Like, I'm just hearing that in a new transformed method. Even like the question that came out the chat, like what is the anti-immigration reasoning for Latinos versus other Latinos, for example, right? It's like the wages of Latinidad. It's a new book.
I mean that has to do with class divisions, right? Like, you know, there are certain Latinos that came here that weren't like working class folks. You know, we talk about rich Venezuelans, rich Cubans, and so that's like a thing. But I'm really more interested in the solidarity question. For me, it's, you know, I look back to this excellent film Made in LA, which is about you know, sweatshop workers in LA. And there's a Mexican woman who goes to New York and she sees how the garment worker industry was like at the turn of the 1900s of the century. And she says it's the same fucking thing, excuse my language. And she recognizes in that moment that like her position within the system of capitalism, of global capitalism, and she feels solidarity with these women who are Jewish women, who are Italian women working in these garment industry, the same industry she is now in the 20th century working in. And so for me, the solidarity piece really comes from understanding our role historically within the confines of like capitalism in how we have that in common with everyone else, with all these other workers from, you know, Central America, from South America, from Africa, who are now from the Caribe that are coming in, fulfilling historically the same role that Mexicans and other Latinos have had.
I guess like also,
yeah.
Go ahead,
Sorry, Almita, we'll give you the last word.
Oh God. No, the other thing I wanted to say is that we also just have to be very careful about not homogenizing Latinos, right? I mean, unfortunately, we're all working with Mexican communities, I think, for the most part. But it is important to learn our history, but it's also important to learn each other's histories, right? You know, one Mexicans are not the same as Guatemalan or Salvadorians. We all have very distinct histories and relationships to the U.S., and we have to learn about that, be open to it. And the other thing is also highlight those communities that are so underrepresented in Latino studies. The Latino Studies Journal, I think, just published a special issue on Colombians in the US, highlighting these groups that are often kind of marginalized, even within our own courses, right? When we talk about Black Lives Matter, I know ALA, the Association for Latina and Latino Anthropologists, published a piece about Black or Afro-Latinos, right? And how we also have to recognize anti-Black racism within our communities, right? And so when we say Latinos for Black Lives Matter, we also have to talk about, yeah, there are Black Latinos as well. And these are things that we have to confront on a daily basis within our family networks, as well as in what we read and what we teach.
Professor Villagran, Professor Miranda, Professor Carlos, Professor Ramirez, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you for having us, Armando, and everyone else at Wisconsin. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the amazing questions. Let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I appreciated being in community with all of you.
And I would like to thank you all as well, and hope to keep in touch about all these things.
Thank you.